Now, before we read this, we all acknowledge from the Bible that God is not the author of confusion. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death,
darkness, I will not be afraid, Lord, for you are with me. Your shepherd's rod and staff protect me.
Thou spreadest a table before me in the sight of mine enemies. Thou hast richly
my cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life.
And love will be with me all my life, and your house will be my home as long as I live.
Forever. Now, what one word best describes what you just heard?
Now, one of the arguments that Sam Gipp uses, and I've heard him do this in live presentations in churches and things like that, and so he's stuck it into this video here, is he will have people get out their different modern translations and read through a very familiar psalm, the 23rd Psalm. And of course, modern translations will differ from one another, from the King James. Some people have the King James, some people have the New King James. And by the end, people are at different places, they're saying different things. And what he does is he sets this all up by sort of sneaking in an assertion that most people never actually think about. And that is, he says, well, we know the Bible says God is not the author of confusion. Well, the Bible does say that. Paul said that to the Corinthians. But he wasn't talking about Bible translations, of course. He was talking about in the church, and he was talking about the orderliness of worship and preaching and presentation. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you could take multiple translations in a language that had not yet been invented when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and when you read them all at the same time, it will not sound the same. And that somehow becomes the confusion that God's not the author of. I mean, that is an incredibly bad example of eisegesis, a complete misusage of the text. But because he just slips it in, it's amazing how many people go, wow, if God's not the author of confusion, and when we all read English translations and they sound different, then that must mean God's not behind this, and that must mean we need one English translation. Well, that's a bad use of the text, first of all. But it also illustrates, I mentioned earlier, this new word that I've come up with, drare, the dogged repetition of already refuted errors. And what you see in King James onlyism is they never apply the same standards as the King James that they apply to modern translations. And I'm going to give you an example of that. You saw in the video where the people sat around and they read the 23rd Psalm, and therefore the King James must be the one that God's given us because it came first and these came later and they've created confusion, right? But the King James wasn't the first Bible translation in English, was it? And so if the King James comes along after other Bible translations, well then, if it created confusion by sounding differently than the preceding Bible translations, then it couldn't be from God. At least that's the argument Sam Gibb's using, and he'd be consistent, right? Because we all know that consistency is the mark of truth, and inconsistency is the mark of a failed argument, isn't it? And so what we're going to do is I'm going to have Rich and Jamie come in here. Come on in, guys, and we have we'll sort of squeeze in here. There we go. We're going to read the 23rd Psalm, except we're going to read from the King James, the Wycliffe Bible, and the Bishop's Bible. And the Bishop's Bible and the Wycliffe Bible came before the King James, and so there won't be any confusion, will there be? Okay, all right. All right, you ready? Okay. God is my shepherd, therefore I can lack nothing. He will cause me to repose myself in pastures full of grass, and He will lead me unto calm waters. He will comfort my soul. He will bring me forth into the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff be the things that do comfort me. Thou wilt prepare a table before me in the presence of mine adversaries. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, and my cup shall be brim full. Truly felicity and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of God for a long time. Thanks, guys. Well, there you go. Evidently, since they don't read identically to one another, I guess the King James produced confusion, which according to Sam Gipp means it can't be from God. So now we have Sam Gipp telling us the King James isn't from God either. What are we ever going to do? Well, what we're going to do is reject really, really bad arguments when we see that they are really, really bad arguments.